This week's Technique Tuesday video is an introduction to stranded colorwork. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. This is the first video in a series on stranded colorwork. In this video, I'll show some examples of what stranded colorwork is, and then we'll explore the two biggest challenges for working stranded colorwork: managing two colors at once and maintaining good tension. So let's get started. I have a few examples of stranded colorwork that I have knit over the years. This particular sweater is quite old and it's somewhat felted. I knit it probably 28 years ago for my niece, who is now expecting her first child. What you can see here is that I have mostly a black sweater. I have a second color that I've knit in any particular row. So I've got green and then red, and here I've got blue and yellow and so on. And so I was alternating between working the black and working the other color in every row. This is a sweater. It's got some holes in it that I knit for my oldest daughter about 20 years ago. And this is another example of stranded colorwork. Here, though, you'll see that I have some areas that are solid color stripes, and then I have places where I'm just alternating between one color and the other every other stitch. And then when we get up to the ladybug area, I have three colors. Anytime I have the dark blue, that's the third color that I added into the work. In this hat, I've got four different colors, but I'm only working two colors at a time. So I have these bands of this sort of classic XO pattern that you'll see in Fair Isle knitting, which is a subset of stranded knitting. Not all stranded colorwork is Fair Isle, although some people use the term Fair Isle generically. That's not really an accurate way to describe all stranded colorwork. So in this particular band of color, I have one color for the background, and then the design, I use two different colors, but never more than one at a time. So in the middle of the band, I use this chartreuse color instead of the light teal color. And then I did that again up in this band. But again, I was only ever working two colors in a given round. This is a Bavarian mitten that I've started working on this past spring and then put to the side. So you'll see here that this is mostly a two-color pattern, but every so often I've got that little blip of red here. But down here I have three colors that I'm rotating through regularly over the course of the round. So that is not unusual in Latvian mittens. It would be unheard of in Fair Isle knitting. Over the course of a given round, you alternate between one color and the other, and when one color is being worked, the other color floats across the back of the work. So we call these strands along the back, we call them floats. One of the things I like to do is do fake in the round swatching so that I can always have the right side facing. I don't have to work a whole bunch of stitches, but I never have to work across the purl side of the fabric. So I'm going to show you how I do that. I'm going to take both of these yarns right here, and I'm going to join both of them at the same time. I'm going to work the first and last stitch always with both of the yarns. So there are kind of three approaches to working with two colors. One is to use whatever method you normally use to knit and just hold one color at a time, so that we're going to alternate just between the purple and then the red. We're going to go back and forth one stitch at a time between each one of these. So I could pick up the purple yarn, I could knit it, then I could drop it and I could pick up the red yarn and knit with it. So I could just keep doing that. It's pretty easy to manage the tension. I wouldn't worry at this point about whether you're picking up below or above a particular color. Don't worry about that. Just practice switching between one color and another. So that's one way. And I'll tell you, when I knit that black sweater with the little color blips on it for my niece 30 years ago, I guarantee you that's the method that I used because I didn't know what else to do. And it turned out perfectly fine. So the other choice then is to hold both yarns in the same hand, but have one of the yarns over one of your fingers. If I can get mine under there. And one over the other. So what color do I need to work with next? Purple. So I work with the purple, and then I'm going to, you know, this is not the way I normally knit, but so I'm not perfect at it. But you're going to just alternate back and forth and get some practice. And if you find it really awkward, you might want to just try knitting a few rows just with the yarn over that finger that you don't normally use, just to kind of get the hang of how you might want to do it. So you can alternate back and forth. If you normally hold the yarn in your left hand, you can do the same thing. You have one yarn in each hand. So I've done a red, and now I want to do a purple. Now I keep my fingers extended way away from the needles. I have my fingers extended, and that has to do with how I have these needles levered against the sides of my palms. There are a lot of knitters who knit with the yarn in their left hand who hold the needles differently, and they keep their fingers very close. So you do the same thing. You just have one over each hand, and you know, I'm terrible at keeping them very close, but you would just alternate back and forth with them like that. So just practice that, and just practice on a swatch like this, back and forth. Now, another alternative is to hold one yarn in each hand. So this is the way that a lot of knitters work, but it does take practice if you've only ever worked with the yarn in one hand. You're more likely to have tension issues, especially at first, if you're not used to working with one yarn in each hand. When I knit that little orange ladybug sweater, that was the first time that I knit with the yarn in my left hand. I couldn't find any way to tension it, and I always just had it over one finger like this. That's all I did. And I knit the whole sweater by just having it over that one finger and trying to figure it out as best I could. And that worked for me. So what I would suggest if you are going to if you want to try one in each hand, is that if you're not used to working or knitting with the yarn in, say, your left hand, practice knitting just with the yarn in your left hand. Like do some garter stitch, back and forth, and get used to it. Then maybe work some of these fake in the round swatches just in stockinette with whichever finger your hand you don't normally use, and then compare that gauge to the gauge that you use or that you get with the other hand. Okay, so I've gotten all the way to the end. What I want to do in this last stitch is knit with both yarns in this last stitch. So I've knit all the way across, and now I'm going to keep this facing me. I'm going to drape this as very loosely, as loose as it can be. And then I'm going to come back over to this first stitch and again knit that stitch with both of the yarns. However you normally knit with the yarn in your right hand, left hand, doesn't matter. You're going to work that stitch. It's going to be very sloppy. It doesn't matter. No one's going to see this. So you're going to have these droopy strands on the back of the work, and now you can come back and you can practice again. So you can practice again alternating one. When you get the hang of that, then you can practice alternating two, and that's when the tension issues can start coming in. You can do 2 stitches, and then you do 2 stitches with the other color. Now what you want to make sure, when you're doing more than 1 stitch in a row in a color, you want to make sure before you're working the next color that the stitches on the right hand needle are not not on the tip, they're past the tip, and that they have as much space between them as the yarn is thick, just like if you were casting on. So they're spread apart a little bit, and then you can bring the yarn around and knit your stitch. What's important here is that you're not pulling on these stitches with a lot of tension. If you have a habit of pulling on your stitch after you complete it, you need to stop doing that. because if you spread your stitches out and you strand this color across the back, you could have it perfectly stranded across the back, and then if you pull on this, it just acts like a drawstring and puts it all together, and then you're going to get a really gathered up stitches. I'll show you what I mean. It's easier to see if I do a wider span. Let me do about 4. So I spread these out. These have at least as much space between them as the yarn is thick, which means that I have enough stranding along the back. But if I were to pull that, then that just pulls them together, and it's going to just cause the fabric to pucker, 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 pucker. So this is the challenge. The second challenge of working stranded color work is, after you've figured out how to manage the 2 different colors of yarn, you need to manage your tension. So I've got some space between them, and I'm keeping my yarn relaxed. I'm not pulling on it tightly. I finished the stitch. I've got some space. And if they're getting bunched up a little bit, I can spread down here so that these are not getting crowded up there. And so you can alternate. So you do that. So then just gradually work on that. 2 at a time, 2 at a time, then 3 at a time, space them 3 at a time, space them 5 stitches apart, just so that you can get used to stranding them and maintaining tension. So one thing you might notice is that your tension is affected, regardless of how hard you work at making sure that your floats are not too tight on the back. You may notice that if you switch from a solid color stockinette to a stranded colorwork section, the stranded colorwork section pulls in like this. Now, this is not necessarily a problem with your tension. Like my tension here is actually fine. I was not pulling too tightly. The issue is that stranded colorwork, because you have those 2 strands, you get those elongated stitches because you've got to fit these 2 strands into the back of the work. The stitches get elongated, which causes them to narrow. So they don't really change their size, they just change their proportion. So a lot of times what you'll see is that stockinette gauge becomes more square, whereas before it would be rectangular. And so the way you counteract that is that you go up a needle size. And for most people, that will be sufficient. Now, I use the same needle size for the whole thing, and so this part drew in a bit. And then for this one, I went up a needle size when I did the stranded part, and then I went back down a needle size when I did this part. Now you might see that this still appears to be pulling in just a little bit, but that's because it's thicker, because we've got 2 layers of, so we got 4 layers of yarn here instead of 2 layers where it's folded over. So it's thicker, which is going to make it, when it's lying flat, it's going to make it look like a pull in a little bit, but it's actually the same gauge. The key to learning any new knitting technique is practice. This is especially true for stranded colorwork. You will likely feel as awkward when you first try handling 2 yarns at once as you felt when you first learned to knit with just a single strand of yarn. Try each of the methods in the video to see which works best for you. And remember, there are 2 challenges to working stranded colorwork: managing the 2 colors and managing your fabric tension. Focus on one challenge at a time, and once you have developed muscle memory for the first challenge, move on to the second one. Next week, we'll explore various ways for managing those floats at the back of the work, and we'll see how those different methods can affect the finished fabric in unexpected ways. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions about videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.